BBC4 continues to trace the history of British science fiction with tales of utopian dreams and the darkest of nightmares.
The notion of a TV set you can't turn off is profoundly creepy.
The season continues with Trouble in Paradise, Monday at 9 on BBC4.
Go to bbc.co.uk/BBC4 to find out more about the Science Fiction Britannia season and to get your very own previews. Now, British sci-fi writers are, it seems, in a class of their own, especially when predicting the future.
Welcome to the future. The utopian dreams and dystopian nightmares of British science fiction. Nobody writes them quite like us. Visions of society where sex, technology, and control of the masses meet in a heady brew. Why have the British been better than anyone at imagining these future heavens and hells? And what do they reveal about us and our deepest fears? For centuries, British science fiction writers have been busy building future worlds, working out how science will control us.
But darling, what on earth is an atom?
I was in on the very start of apathy control.
Come along, Mary, I must see that machine.
What makes us human, more than anything else, is the ability to imagine an alternative state. And once you say, well, you can imagine an alternative state, then you're going to have utopias.
At the heart of these blueprints for society is a universal question. How will we organize the burgeoning population and keep it under control? The two most famous books of utopian fiction are British: Brave New World by Aldous Huxley and 1984 by George Orwell are so important they've even entered the language. One is a vision of the future full of sex and shopping. The other is a story of oppression and violence.
I don't care what you do to her. It's Julia! Julia, not me! Not me!
Orwell and Huxley first met here at Eton College in 1917, years before they would write their masterpieces. Orwell was 14 and in his first year at Eton. Huxley was his supply teacher. The first account of utopia available to them, and to any educated Englishman, was appropriately enough set on an island. The father of the utopian dream was a politician in the court of Henry VIII. Henry VIII's Chancellor, Thomas More, told the story of a hypothetical society where the inhabitants live an idyllic life on a beautiful, fortified island.
Everyone wears the same clothes, everyone has the same working hours, you're not allowed to travel from one city to another, and you don't need to because every city is identically the same.
Utopia may be a fantasy island, but its rules and regulations control every moment of life for those who live there. No man may live idle, but they divide the day and night into 24 hours. Appoint 6 of these for work, 3 of which are before dinner and 3 after. They then sup, and at 8 o'clock, counting from noon, go to bed and sleep 8 hours. The problem with utopias like More's is that nothing much happens in them.
If everybody's good, what do they do for fun, as it were? And they've all had that problem. You know, the visitor to the utopia frequently says, this may be all very well for you, but I'm bored. That's the subtext.
Utopias were generally pastoral, celebrating a traditional way of life in a place out of time.
Most utopias are very boring to read and also presumably very boring to live in. They essentially seem to involve wearing medieval smocks and basket weaving.
Adding science to the mix took these bland visions and turned them into exciting prophecies of the future. Francis Bacon's 17th century utopia, New Atlantis, made some staggering predictions. Skyscrapers, submarines, junk food, and synthetic materials.
Science, progress, little doubt that the sky was the limit.
By the end of the 19th century, Britons were used to the idea that science had answers for every aspect of human life. Charles Darwin had rewritten the past. British science fiction writers believed they could predict the future. Herbert George Wells was Britain's greatest prophet of utopian progress. He believed that science would actually improve mankind. His book, The Shape of Things to Come, was made into a film in 1936 and became a landmark in cinematic design. Wells's story predicts the Second World War, which reduces civilization to a pre-industrial rabble. A group of scientists rebuild a utopian society called Wings Over the World, based, bizarrely, in Basra, Iraq. By 2036, all people live in futuristic underground cities.
Well, Wells is someone who, in the 1890s, is a science journalist. But there is this moment about 1899 when he writes a sequence of really, really interesting utopias of cars, planes, moving sidewalks, all of that very distinct kind of iconography of the future.
Wells even predicted satellite TV and worldwide media events.
What is this progress? And that voice is sounding to the whole world. No!
Decades before the first live global broadcast when man landed on the moon.
Small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
He also predicted how they'd get there, by means of his most fantastical invention. A space gun, which fires people into orbit.
There they go. That faint gleam of light. I feel that what we've done is monstrous. What they've done is magnificent.
But there is always a dark side to utopia, and there was certainly a dark side to H.G. Wells. He was a eugenicist. Eugenics was a branch of science invented in Britain devoted to improving the breed of man.
What do you do with people who don't fit your utopian plan? Well, as it so happens, you do with them generally what people have done in real life. You kill them or enslave them. So at that point, it ceases to be such a dandy utopia. And as Nathaniel Hawthorne pointed out, the Puritan fathers went to America to set up a perfect society, and the first things they built were a scaffold and a prison.
The things that utopians are worried about are the degeneracy of most people. People are not good enough, and there are too many of them.
In his much earlier book, A Modern Utopia, written in 1905, Wells presents his hopes for a utopian super race and what he'd like to do to those who don't measure up. There remain perverse and incompetent persons. There are people of weak character who become drunkards, drug takers, and the like. Then there are persons tainted with certain foul and transmissible diseases. All these people spoil the world for others. They may become parents, and with most of them, there is manifestly nothing to be done but to seclude them from the great body of the population. You must resort to a kind of social surgery.
He thought that people should be beautiful in mind and body, strong and beautiful in mind and body. And for that, you have to get rid of inferior types.
Just as Britain's cities were to be cleared of their slums, so H.G. Wells wanted to attempt a mass clearance of the population's lowest elements. It made sense that model cities should be full of model citizens, a view shared by many.
We measure the appalling physical effects of slum life, the slow undermining of the constitution, the dull hopelessness bred by filthy, verminous surroundings. Remember that none of these men knew they were being photographed.
In your good world or your bad world, how are you going to arrange people according to their skills and abilities, conversely according to how much you feel they need to be repressed?
Wells says, the men of my new republic will have an ideal, and that will make killing worth the while.
The First World War provided a real hell on earth. But you had to be fit to be sent to fight. One young man rejected by the army was Aldous Huxley, who was blind in one eye. He was sent to teach French at Eton College instead, and among his mocking pupils was George Orwell.
I think Orwell regarded him, like most of the boys, as a bit of a joke. He was an extremely bad teacher. He was so short-sighted he couldn't see them making, I don't think they made those gestures then, but sort of, gestures of that kind, I should think. He was a serious oddball.
Everything conspired to make him possibly seem rather aloof. With his reputation for great intellectual distinction, this would confirm the view that he was a remote egghead.
It was Orwell's first year there, a welcome relief from the totalitarian hell of his prep school. While Huxley taught Orwell to appreciate the works of Baudelaire, 300,000 men were dying on the fields of Passchendaele, while Orwell conjugated his verbs. Russia stood on the brink of revolution. The future writings of both men would struggle to reflect the changing world around them. Orwell was reading H.G. Wells avidly, finding it wonderful escapism from the horrors of the real world.
For a boy growing up in the early 1900s, it was a wonderful thing to meet the stories of Mr. Wells. And here was this wonderful man talking about the inhabitants of the planets and the bottom of the sea. And above all, he knew that the future would not be what respectable people expected.
Even at Eton, the most exclusive school in the country, there were strong class divisions. Satirizing class would be a key feature of Orwell's novel 1984.
Well, he called himself, with his usual comic accurate irony, a member of the lower upper middle class. That was the upper class without money. So he knew how to tip servants, so he had no tips. He knew how to ride, though they had no horses. He knew how to shoot, but they had no guns.
Huxley was reading Wells too, but he hated it. He decided to write an anti-Wellsian work of science fiction. That book would be Brave New World, a catalogue of all the things that this young fogey detested about the modern world. Taking on the concerns of the British utopian, sex, class, and controlling the masses.
In this year of stability, after Ford 632, standard men and women in uniform batches, the whole of a small factory staffed with the products of a single egg, the principle of mass production at last applied to biology.
Brave New World is set in the 26th century. It's the ultimate class satire, imagining a world where people are manufactured on a production line, literally being made to order.
Brave New World is primarily interested in biotechnology as means of social control, as means of social shaping.
Production of babies is entirely artificial in laboratories, in hatcheries, and they're deliberately produced in different grades by releasing less oxygen to the brain when it's forming. You can produce either alphas or betas, or gammas, deltas, or epsilons.
The British class system is taken to its logical conclusion with science. Even in the 26th century, no Epsilon will get to go to Eton. At Eton, they alighted on the roof of Upper School. On the opposite side of Schoolyard, the 52 stories of Lupton's Tower gleamed white in the sunshine. Eton is reserved exclusively for upper caste boys and girls. After being born as an alpha or an epsilon, brainwashing is used to remind each child of their station in life.
Wear khaki. Oh no, I don't want to play with Delta children.
Huxley invents hypnopedia, a kind of subconscious teaching discovered by accident when a little boy falls asleep with the radio on. While the child was asleep, a broadcast program from London suddenly started to come through.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
And the next morning, little Reuben woke up, repeating word for word a long lecture by that curious old writer, George Bernard Shaw, who was speaking, according to a well-authenticated tradition, about his own genius.
Few people think more than 2 or 3 times a year, but I have made an international reputation for myself by thinking once or twice a week.
To little Reuben's wink and snigger, this lecture was, of course, perfectly incomprehensible. The principle of sleep teaching, or hypnopedia, had been discovered.
Well, in the 1920s, just before Brave New World was written, radio had become a very important medium. And there was a certain anxiety about the way that radio could be and would be used. In America, the President, Herbert Hoover, said that it was absolutely unthinkable that a medium as powerful as radio should be allowed to fall into the hands of advertisers. Within 2 years, that was exactly what had happened in America.
Like all utopians, Huxley was suspicious of mass culture and worried about the dumbing down effects of the media. His vision of a leisure society gave him the chance to satirize the things he most detested: advertising, cinema, and sexual promiscuity.
Huxley, in writing Brave New World, is obviously writing a comedy. It's full of jokes. It's not intended at the time he writes it as a serious text, although it was, in a sense, rather more accurate than he supposed it could be.
"Take hold of those metal knobs on the arm of your chair," whispered Lenina. "Otherwise you won't get any of the Feely effects." The plot of the film was extremely simple. A few minutes after the oohs and ahs, a duet having been sung and a little love made on that famous bearskin, every hair of which could be separately and distinctly felt. The beta blonde was ravished away, and the bearskin made a final appearance before the last stereoscopic kiss faded into darkness.
Any dystopia or any utopia, they all have to deal with sex. Who is going to sleep with whom, under what circumstances, who gets to have children, how are the children raised, what are the sexual crimes. They've all got this stuff in them.
No, it's a plot. He can't be responsible for all these.
In Brave New World, the worst sexual crime is to be part of a family, and for men and women to have children together.
The good girls are the ones who do their orgies when they're supposed to be doing their orgies. They're socially compliant. You know, they do the orgies, they have the false pregnancy hormones and things, though they can't really get pregnant because babies are grown in bottles.
Huxley regarded it as almost as being another form of consumer activity. Is strangely passionless. And it's said that one of the reasons why Brave New World was so popular in America in the 1950s was that it seemed to people to be advocating a kind of a rather exciting world of guilt-free sex, whereas in fact I think Huxley was trying to say something different.
His heady mix of free love and drugs kept people happy, but with a dark side. One of his cleverest inventions was Soma, a drug uncannily like Prozac.
People were, in a phrase that Huxley used throughout the 1930s, he said, "We're being taught to love our slavery." They willingly agreed to be pushed into line.
Huxley said that Soma had all the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, none of their defects. He drew his inspiration for Soma from his observations on a journey into darkest England, a trip up north to observe mass unemployment during the Depression. Huxley found the whole thing unbearable. He loathed the hard beds, inedible food, and baths round the edges of which are to be found selections from the hairs of all the commercial travellers on the northern circuit.
Into each line.
Upper-class squeamishness oozed from his every pore. If that wasn't bad enough, he then had the misfortune to meet some unemployed miners.
I'm sure no ghost could be as terrifying as these spectres of flesh and blood who walk the streets of our northern cities. Dead men hopelessly resigned to death. One could wish they were less resigned, less dumbly patient, but the dole has taken the violence out of their despair.
Huxley turned the welfare state into Soma because he believed that in the future, people would be controlled not by handouts, but by pleasure. When Brave New World was published in 1933, this already seemed over-optimistic. Most thought pain was far more likely to be the measure of control. George Orwell summed it up. Brave New World was a good caricature of the hedonistic utopia, the kind of thing that seemed possible and even imminent, but it had no relation to the actual future. What we are moving towards is something more like the Spanish Inquisition, and probably far worse.
There were a lot of elements in play, and one of them was the continuing belief that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was the workers' paradise and that that was the way to go. Then along came Mr. Hitler, who again presented himself as a savior, someone who's going to make everything much better and improve everybody's lot. People believed him too. Well, after those two, it was kind of hard to keep on believing in the possibilities.
Just 4 years after the sex and drugs of Brave New World, a new British dystopia appeared. It was Murray Constantine's science fiction classic, Swastika Night. Published in 1937, it immediately caught the eye of George Orwell, who was preparing to write his own bleak vision of the future. In Swastika Night, the Nazis have ruled for 700 years, and Hitler is worshipped as a god. Under his laws, women have been enslaved.
As a woman is above a worm, so is a man above a woman. As a woman is above a worm, so is a worm above a Christian. So, my comrades, the lowest thing, the meanest, filthiest thing that crawls on the face of the earth is a Christian woman. To touch her is the uttermost defilement for a German man. My sons, forget it not, on pain of death or torture or being cut from the blood. Heil Hitler!
Swastika Night is a very remarkable novel, I think. It's only a slight exaggeration, I think, of the Nazi view of what women are for, that they're for home and reproduction.
Hitler put some of this into practice. He set up enclaves where SS member men could have biological wives in addition to their other wives. And the idea was to make as many Aryan babies as possible. Mind you, they had quite nice swimming pools. They weren't locked in rooms. They were actually treated quite well, which is why some of them did it.
Swastika Night described a living hell for women. But why had Murray Constantine chosen to write about female oppression? In 1985, the truth was revealed. Murray Constantine was not just another well-born utopian like Huxley. He was in fact a she, Catherine Burdekin. Science fiction was the perfect place for her to express her fears for the future and frustrations with the present. Catherine wanted to go to university, but her parents wouldn't consent. Instead, she married a barrister in 1915. Restless with married life, she became a nurse with the Red Cross during the First World War. Her experiences deeply affected her. She blamed men for the destruction she had witnessed. Catherine left her husband after 6 years of marriage, turning to a female companion, Isabel Allen Burns, who remained with her for the rest of her life. Swastika Night warned against the cult of masculinity. George Orwell read the book very closely. Theme after theme of it reappears in Orwell's own work of science fiction, which was published in 1949. But Orwell did something groundbreaking in his novel. Rather than set the book in the far future, his nightmare vision was due to happen in his readers' own lifetimes.
If you're writing in the immediate post-war period, there is a sense in which the future has been cancelled. The only way that you can think about projecting forward is by a sort of slightly surreal, disturbed version of your present day.
In 1984, a state of perpetual war exists, and citizens have given up their freedom for security. Already Chelmsford has, we are told, been atom-bombed. The hero, Winston Smith, inwardly rebels against the totalitarian state he lives in, which demands absolute obedience and punishes even the thought of wrongdoing. "You are the last man," said O'Brien. "You are the guardian of the human spirit. You shall see yourself as you are. Take off your clothes." Winston Smith could not remember whether at any time since his arrest he had taken off all his clothes. He stopped short. An involuntary cry had broken out of him.
Well, 1984 is primarily about threats to freedom, which go beyond mere matters of everyday freedom to freedom of thought. You have a government which not only wants to control what people can do, but control what people can think.
The language is being destroyed. It's being turned into something called newspeak, which will have very, very few words, so that, as Syme, the chap who's doing it, boasts, you won't be able to have a bad thought. Thought crime, which is thinking anything against the party, won't be possible.
Since childhood, Orwell had suffered at the hands of a number of ruthless institutional regimes. His prep school in Eastbourne made a particularly deep impression.
A terrible place of bullying staff and horrible rich kids who scorned him, which he writes about brilliantly.
Hello, Radio Terminal. BBC here.
Another model for 1984 was the BBC. Orwell had worked in the Eastern Service during the war.
I think Orwell was certainly fairly miserable working at the BBC. He was working for an unashamedly propagandist institution. I mean, basically lying to people, or what we would now call spin.
That's right, Mr. Addison. As we're always telling these kids, they must play as a team.
Yes, and don't forget, in this war we're fighting today, we must all play for the team, particularly as the team we are playing for is Britain.
The third model for 1984 was perhaps the most terrifying of all. Stalinist Russia.
An important part of 1984 is that history is falsified. Everything's rewritten. Enemies of the state are just airbrushed out, as it were.
But even worse than propaganda, in Orwell's opinion, was the dumbing down of society. Orwell was deeply worried that films, football, beer and gambling were stopping the working classes from having strength of character. In 1984, the working classes are given prole feed to keep them quiet. The Ministry of Truth supplied the multifarious needs of the party, but also a whole operation at a lower level for the benefit of the proletariat. A whole chain of separate departments dealing with proletarian literature, music, drama, and entertainment. Generally, here were produced rubbishy newspapers containing almost nothing except sport, crime, and astrology. Sensational 5-cent novelette films oozing with sex and sentimental songs, which were composed entirely by mechanical means. Orwell may have worried about the cultural life of the proles, but he still regarded them as the only hope for the future.
It's Winston Smith looking out the window at the woman hanging up the laundry and singing. And thinking, well, she's definitely the masses.
The prole woman.
By a look and a
That's a Prole Beat song, isn't it?
Last month, monsieur. Number 2765, house at 8.
The product of an electronic machine, and she sings it as if it meant something. She's as solid as a pillar, as sturdy as... You know, Julia, she's beautiful.
1984 is a brilliant insight into the British class system, written by someone struggling to overcome their own background. The old Etonian just couldn't escape his own prejudices when writing about the proles.
He says, however hard you try, it's very difficult to escape from your childhood stereotypes. I was brought up to believe that the working classes smelt.
Well, the audience for all fiction is basically a middle-class audience, because the working classes in Britain don't, by and large, tend to read. That's always created a bit of a problem for utopian and dystopian fiction, in that it's often written by socialist, politically active people who are therefore already in a state of tension with a large proportion of their audience.
He says to the middle classes, you know, to join the revolutionary fight. You've nothing to lose but your H's, you know.
Orwell satirizes middle-class attitudes towards sex. Sexual intercourse, he writes, was to be looked on as a slightly disgusting minor operation, like having an enema.
Just there, you're not to see me for the next 3 or 4 minutes. To make sure, you better turn round.
But what are you going to do?
Please, I'll let you know.
In 1984, Julia is the bad girl. She's outwardly compliant. She seems to be a model party member, but she harbors deep subversive thoughts. She's very attractive to Winston Smith because she offers real sex. She actually enjoys sex, and not only that, she gets some lipstick somewhere. Very, very, very naughty thing to have done.
Your face.
Do you like it?
Yes.
Pro women use this stuff. I don't know if I put it on right.
Sexual relations breed an intimacy and a valuing between people. When you're in love, the person you love is the most important thing. That means the state and the utopia is not the most important thing. So sex is always a danger.
The lasting legacy of 1984 as a novel is Big Brother is Watching You, is this idea of what a British totalitarian society might be like.
He scrutinized each list of casualties. He even found time to rejoice in accounts of individual acts of heroism by our glorious soldiers.
Nothing is private. Everyone is watched all the time through telescreens, which pick up as well as relay, and which are so accurate they can observe your heartbeat.
The notion of a TV set you can't turn off is profoundly creepy. And I think probably that side of 1984 has much more to do with the notion of the surveillance society, which didn't actually happen in Britain for about 50 years. Now we are, I believe, the most photographed, recorded, surveilled, spied on population in the world.
Two gin-soaked tears trickled down the sides of his nose, but it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. He'd won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother.
This last passage about loving Big Brother is a deeply ironic passage, because who has Big Brother got? He's just got this drunk. It's not the victory of the state over a already beaten man. It's the worthlessness of power.
But certainly as a writer and as a work, 1984 is a particular, I think, is it's a wonderful piece. I mean, and also, of course, that does lead into that whole thing about British SF being, a bit depressing, because it's not the happiest of endings at the end of 1984. I could make it a lot worse, actually, if I was rewriting it. But.
George Orwell sent his old teacher a copy of the book. Aldous Huxley eventually read 1984 and sent him a patronizing letter. How fine the book is, but my own belief is that the ruling oligarchy will find less arduous and wasteful ways of governing, and that these ways will resemble those which I described in Brave New World. Orwell didn't live to find out if his predictions would come true. But within a year of the book appearing, its telescreens had taken over the nation's living rooms.
He did foresee a certain way that television was about to be incorporated into everybody's homes. He also foresaw a very long time before it actually happened, the incorporation of television into public spaces. I think 1984 is the first prediction that people would put televisions up in pubs, for instance.
There's a certain irony in the fact that Orwell warning about the power of television then becomes the basis of one of the most important early BBC television programmes.
The TV drama appeared on the BBC in 1954, just 5 years after the book had come out.
Atomic war, famine, revolution.
It had been a literary sensation, but the television play made an even bigger splash. It was watched by 7 million viewers. Even the Queen tuned in.
This, in 1984, is London, chief city of Airstrip 1, a province of the state of Oceania.
It was at the time that there was a big censorship kerfuffle. The video nasties of the 1950s were American horror comics, Tales from the Crypt, that sort of stuff, which lots of censorious busybodies wanted banned. And people said, why is the BBC putting out a horror comic?
Last night's play insulting to people's intelligence. Shocking bad taste on Sunday night.
We've all come to the conclusion that the persons responsible for putting on the play are sadists and readers of horror comics. For weeks on Sundays we have to watch dismal, immoral and sadistically highbrow plays. Thank God for Wilfred Pickles and the Grove family.
Some people were very shocked at the time, or said they were, and the newspapers in particular took that theme up. Said, why were we made to see all this upsetting material on our television screens, including rats? The British public seeing rats on their television screen. I mean, at that point you just have a laugh.
What did you want me to do? No! By itself, pain is not always enough.
This was no laughing matter. 40-year-old Beryl Mervyn died of a heart attack while watching the play. It was official. TV was so bad for you it could kill you. This fitted perfectly into the nightmare visions of British science fiction writers.
Well, there's a strong element in dystopian fiction which assumes that television will be used as a medium of social control, either directly, as in 1984, or indirectly, as in Brave New World and the year of the Sex Olympics.
BBC writer Nigel Neal, who had adapted 1984 for television, saw a future where TV controlled the hearts, minds, and libidos of viewers. The year of the Sex Olympics, shown in 1968, returned to the old favourites, sex and nudity, with a 1960s spin.
So keep looking. Maybe tonight's winners make it to the Olympics. First round then, and welcome to those king-style lovers, Cara Dindo and Stuart Pendley. Hello there, Stuart and Cara.
In Brave New World, sex was so casual, no one cared who you copped off with. 30 years later, in the year of the Sex Olympics, sex was banned, apart from the champions in training, televised in a constant stream of pornography.
1984 is about the government of a miserable future, whereas Year of the Sex Olympics is about the media of a miserable future. Orwell had to imagine television. He didn't know that much about it. Nigel Neal was a television professional who'd lived within it for 20 years by the time he wrote Year of the Sex Olympics.
At that time, the big thing was overpopulation. That's the great dread that a population of the world would just go right out of control. It is better to watch all the sex you like. In fact, you're almost compelled to. That you watch big television screens of wonderful quality, and you see the most beautiful people all having it off with the purpose, a very noble purpose, of calming the entire population of the world.
When the audience tired of their diet of TV sex, the channel executives put on a new kind of program.
The live show. Vision units set inside and outside the hut. Main unit inside is set in roof.
It's the first ever reality television show, 24 hours a day of cruelty and violence.
The basic joke is that TV executives will kill for ratings. If you look at it now, you would assume that it was written in reaction to the craze for reality television that's only been around for the last 2 or 3 years. It's a piece of work that's still astonishingly, indeed terrifyingly relevant.
If dystopian science fiction has been obsessed by TV, so TV has been in love with science fiction. Since 1963, the world-weary Doctor Who has delivered a galaxy of troubled planets right into our living rooms.
If anybody has mass-produced dystopias in Britain, it's been Doctor Who.
What a way to travel. Invariably, the society that it depicts for whenever the TARDIS lands in the 1970s is some kind of terrible dystopia. There's been a military coup or fascism has taken power.
Time to find out the truth. Time to find out if the waste from your product is causing these maggots to appear.
That's enough! I warn you, Doctor, if you persist in these slanders, I shall have you restrained under the Emergency Powers Act.
You have no such right.
The necessary authority was brought to me this morning.
Quite often, Doctor Who would turn up somewhere and there'd be an external menace. There'd be a monster out there. But there'd also be some petty official who was in his way, stopping him doing anything about the monster. And the point was to sideline the job's worth and get the creature killed.
Okay, give me an hour. Give me half an hour. At least give me a chance to talk to the wretched man.
You've exactly 32.5 minutes.
Right.
I suppose the ultimate irony of this came in the 1970s, where we went back to his home planet and found that it was even worse. Yeah, it was like the worst kind of boring, fussy, class-ridden society, and that's why he'd left in the first place.
Right outside the capital itself. I'm in trouble now.
After you've arrested the personnel, impound the machine.
Of course, Castellano.
British superheroes are always middle-class professionals, from doctors to judges. The next iconic figure to emerge in British science fiction was Judge Dredd, who first appeared in the comic 2000 AD in 1977. His draconian law enforcement tactics in the dystopian Megacity 1 were an extreme satire of a police state where the word of the law controls the population mercilessly. Science fiction writers have continued to use dystopias to rage about the way the modern world is going.
I think it is disgusting, something that will be done soon.
And the promise I make now is inflation.
Dystopian fiction is inevitably attractive to angry writers, because it allows them to express all their worst fears and all their hatreds. It is particularly attractive to older writers who are in a state of incipient despair.
Anthony Burgess was the king of the complainers. He used science fiction to lambast everything he disliked. Burgess's most famous novel, A Clockwork Orange, is a dystopian nightmare of teenage violence.
It is on one level, a grumpy old git saying they should get their hair cut and they shouldn't play their records so loud. But on another level, it's a work of imaginative projection, in that it does get into the mind of a juvenile delinquent, of a young tearaway.
In fact, Burgess had very personal reasons for wanting to examine the mind of a teenage criminal. He had been horrified to witness the mods and rockers fighting on Brighton Beach in the 60s, but his brush with violence went even deeper. His wife had been attacked by American GIs during the war. Burgess wanted to write a book from the point of view of her attackers. In A Clockwork Orange, teenage delinquent Alex is rehabilitated after a life of vicious crime. Burgess invents the Ludovico method, a sort of aversion therapy which uses drugs and televised violence as tools of reform.
Nobody watches television in A Clockwork Orange unless they're strapped to a chair and have their eyes held open, which is quite an interesting vision of the future.
By my brothers, one vish I did not like, though, was when they put like clips on the skin of my forehead, so that my top glass lids were pulled up and up and up, and I could not shut my glazies. I tried to smack and said, "This must be a real horror show film if you are so keen on my videoing it." And one of the white coat vecs said, smacking, "Horror show is right, friend. A real show of horrors."
A Clockwork Orange, you could argue, is about generational anxiety, about a sense in which language is shifting, and he was someone who was very invested in the literary language. He saw himself as the heir to James Joyce. Absurdly.
Burgess saw himself as the literary successor to George Orwell, too. In the 1970s, he turned his attentions to writing a reply to 1984. He called his book 1985. He set out to prove that Orwell wasn't writing about the future at all. He says that everything described in 1984 was already happening when the book was written.
A lot of the things that people now think of as little bits of inventive prophecy were really inventive satires on things that were actually happening at the time. I can remember the streets of London exactly as Orwell described them. Run down and seedy, the lifts kept on failing, everything smelt of stale cabbage.
Now please, come along there. Them stew is soft, them
Even the Big Brother posters were borrowed, according to Burgess. The Bennett Correspondence College had widely billboarded a sign saying, "Let me be your big brother," at the time the book was written. Burgess decided to rewrite the novel and give his alternative vision of the 80s. According to him, Britain would be an Islamic country in the stranglehold of the trade unions. The 13th night of the general strike was a night of the big fires. Those who believed that these had been started by the sons of the Prophet were disabused by the spectacle of the bright destruction of the tall, thin building in the Strand, devoted to Islamic popular culture.
I think Anthony Burgess was asked to write 1985 precisely because he was seen as a prominent modern Orwellian writer. But it is, yes, it's just putting the boot into things that he disapproved of, including trade unions and the hordes of Islam.
I can't take Burgess as seriously as he takes himself. I think he just didn't like paying taxes, and sort of didn't like trade unionists as a class. He'd risen out of that.
As the year 1984 approached, other responses to the novel appeared. Brazil is a version of the story that pokes fun at the bureaucracy of the totalitarian state. It's a dark vision of drudgery and red tape, where people live in a state of constant fear of an unseen enemy.
I think it's kind to say that Brazil's a reworking of 1984. What it is a rip-off of 1984. I mean, it just completely steals everything from 1984 and does it again, perhaps as a nightmare comedy.
I'd say they're nearly out of the game.
For instance, the world of Brazil is hideously arbitrary as well as cruel. It's also inefficient. The secret police are quite likely to arrest the wrong people, whereas Big Brother is actually frighteningly efficient. He knows Winston's the rebel and he gets him.
The mistakes of
wrongful arrests, things not quite working, central services, everything always blowing up, you know, and it's never them it's always someone else. You know, there's terrorists around who are doing it. There weren't. It was just bad servicing. So, yeah, and I think and also quintessentially British, the class structure, you know, that if you're connected, you can get on.
Brazil, like 1984 before it, took inspiration from the propaganda of Stalin's Russia.
It was kind of 40s deco-futuristic. You look in the Russian poster books, I mean, we used the colours from those posters and the starkness of them, you know, and quite bizarre qualities of them, you know. But basically they were all posters warning you, just watch your step.
Brazil was a film I loved on release, and I loved particularly because of its sort of dirty magical realism, if you like. You know, the whole kind of thing about the ducts and kind of imagined, as it were, dystopic London, full of kind of writhing ducts behind every wall panel. And then I went down into the tube. I sort of almost dropped straight out of the cinema into the London tube system and saw this kind of duct coming over the wall with right at the bottom of it a little sign saying, "Speak here." Brazil grasps, if you like, that kind of retro-futurity about London, the idea that it's looking back to an era in which technology was more effective.
I remember in the film just having to do sheets and sheets and sheets of receipts and documents, and it was Terry was a stickler for getting everyone right. You know, that's not right. That has to be the receipt of the receipt.
Sign here, please. There. Thank you. Same again, please. What's that? Press harder this time. Good.
Oh, but this is all about.
That is your receipt for your husband. Thank you. And this is my receipt for your receipt.
We would probably create the best possible, oppressive totalitarian state because we have the most small-minded, petty officials imaginable. Nobody likes it when the men from the council come round and tell them what to do.
In the British vision of dystopia, petty bureaucracy and brutal torture go hand in hand. Terry Gilliam's Brazil paints a picture of doom and gloom on an epic scale.
Amongst the things I admired about Brazil, cut to the chase, one was just the visuals. The visuals and the visual imagination on display in Brazil is just stunning. But it also had the bravery to have a really, really dark ending. I mean, that didn't work in America, so they didn't have that. They changed the ending. But the ending is just spellbinding. I mean, it's a real sort of sucker punch.
The way in which Brazil shows the terror of the state is not in the way that it appeared in 1984, which is the secret police apparatus. What it actually draws on is something that was much more contemporary and real, and that was the death squad and the torture chamber, the kind of things that are in fact going on at that very time in Central America.
Brazil and 1985 were not the only works of science fiction to tackle Orwell's 1984. Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale describes a regime of totalitarian hell set in present-day America.
My rule for The Handmaid's Tale was that I wasn't going to put anything into it that human societies hadn't already done. So one way or another, all those bits and pieces, I assembled them together in a somewhat different way, but we've done it all. We're capable of every single bit of it.
In The Handmaid's Tale, most of the population are infertile. The few women who can have children are enslaved by the state and forced to hide themselves away from the rest of the world with the single mission of producing babies for rich, childless couples. Modesty is invisibility, said Aunt Lydia. Never forget it. To be seen is to be, her voice trembled, penetrated. What you must be, girls, is impenetrable. She called us girls.
If you are dealing with a really repressive regime, you can't just walk in and say to somebody on the street, "So how are things?" they're not going to say they're really terrible. They're going to say, fine, because if they don't say fine, they'll be killed. The pendulum always is swinging between extreme license, which is probably about where we are now, the anything goes kind of thing, and extreme repression. And the best place to live is probably when it's right in the middle.
Watching from the island shore, we've seen totalitarian regimes come and go. We've worried about Americanization, overpopulation, brainwashing, and even reality television.
There certainly was a distinctive British sort of greyness about a lot of science fiction, real sort of contrast between American science fiction, which was very much reflected the fact that the Americans regarded themselves as having won the Second World War, and it's all can-do, and it was great, and it's brilliant, and the future was going to be super and wonderful and brilliant, whereas British science fiction did genuinely, and almost to the extent of a cliche, reflect the great sort of the loss of empire and the days of austerity that lasted long after the Second World War.
Fears, not hopes, have shaped our visions of the future. The biggest worry has been about giving up our identity, of being controlled by the state and losing our individuality.
The British vision of the dystopia is always, the individual being crushed by bureaucracy. This may well have something to do with the British temperament and the British experience.
The notion of a free individual with an imagination and creativity and difference from other people is something no utopia can contain.
In a dystopia, you don't have choice and free will because conditions are imposed upon you. And in a utopia, you don't need choice and free will because what would you need them for? Everything's perfect.
There is something else about the organization of utopias and dystopias that ideally suits the British temperament.
Class has always been very important in British fiction as a whole, and inevitably it affects British utopian and dystopian fiction to an inordinate extent, so that one does, in fact, get a lot of English utopian, dystopian fiction, which is hypersensitive to issues of class.
Even now, at the beginning of the 21st century, the two giants, 1984 and Brave New World, are still frighteningly relevant for defining our future.
For a while it looked as if 1984 was going to win, but then the wall came down and we thought, well, that's the end of that Brave New World. We're just all going to go shopping and have sex, forever after, and that will be the end of it. But that was wrong too, because now we have 1984 coming back with a vengeance. And Big Brother really is watching you, and Big Brother wants to watch you a lot more for your own good.
It seems that if we are going to guard ourselves against terrorism, something like that might be an advantage. And of course, on the other hand, you say, well, where has liberty gone? Where has privacy gone? And it's, I think, to the credit of the utopian tradition that it foresaw this dilemma.
Tomorrow is a lovely day.
Next Monday on 4, the final part of The Martians and Us. Next, tonight, the tension ratchets up a notch for the brilliant and daring remake of a cult sci-fi classic.
If today your heart is weary, if every little thing looks gray, just forget your troubles and learn to say, tomorrow is a lovely day.